Good evening. My name's Carl Brown, and I'm one of the ministers at North Highlands Baptist Church. I'm so glad you could join me at my home today for another backyard Bible study. Today we're going to be looking at the very end, the last chapter of 1 Samuel, and going into the first 4 chapters of 2 Samuel. So wherever you are, separate yourself, get ready to get in to a good study, grab your copy of the Bible, and let's get into the Word. Just to remind you of where we were last week, when we finished in 1 Samuel chapter 30, David had went out to fight against the Israelites with the Philistines and then changed his mind, or I should say he didn't change his mind. The Philistines changed his mind for him and said, "You're not fighting with us." And so he went back home to Ziklag, his home, his town that was given to him in the land of the Philistines, and it had been burned and looted. And so he actually took his men and he went and rescued all the prisoners that were taken by the Amalekites, and he destroyed them. And now he's come back and he's at Ziklag. At the same time, we left it where Saul was ready to fight the Philistines that had come against him and didn't know what to do. And he was so desperate to have the Lord's blessing and to find out what to do that he did a seance and called up the dead and called up Samuel from the dead. And when Samuel confronted him, Samuel's ghost confronted him, said, "Hey, why don't you call me up? You're an idiot. You're a failure. God's rejected you. And tomorrow you're going to be with me because you and your sons are going to die." That's where Saul is right now. And that's where we begin our lesson today. So in chapter 31, it says, "Now the Philistines fought against Israel. The Israelites fled before them, and many fell slain at Mount Gilboa. The Philistines pressed hard after Saul and his sons, and they killed his sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. The fighting grew fierce around Saul, and when the archers overtook him, they wounded him critically." Verse 4, "Saul said to his armor-bearer, 'Draw your sword and run me through, or these uncircumcised fellows will come and run me through and abuse me.' But his armor-bearer was terrified and would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died with him. So Saul and his 3 sons and his armor-bearer and all his men died together that same day." This is exactly what Samuel had said was going to happen. He said, "You're going to go against the Philistines tomorrow. They're going to fight you, and you're going to lose. And not only are you going to lose, your sons are going to die, and then you're going to die." And Saul knew that. And so Saul, when he heard and saw that his sons were dead, and they were fighting kind of on a mountaintop, and they were surrounded, and the archers had wounded him, he knew that what Samuel had said was about to be true. And he did not want to be tortured or abused. And so he wanted to try to die with some dignity. And the way that kings did that, or people did that at the time, was to fall on their own sword. So he tells his armor bearer to hold his sword where he can fall, and he won't do it. So Saul had to kill himself. He fell on his own sword. But he was about to die anyway. I mean, he had been critically injured with an arrow. He was surrounded. Philistines were closing in. He was 72 years old already. And so he just ended it. The reign of the first king of Israel, the first king, the first anointed king of Israel, came to an end in really a sad, sad way. And the people, when they found out, in verse 7, the Israelites along the valley and those across the Jordan saw that the Israelite army had fled and that Saul and his sons had died, they abandoned their towns and fled, and the Philistines came and occupied them. The army fled when Saul died, and not only did the army flee, but all the people in all the surrounding towns where the Philistines were lost all their hope, and they fled too. So now the Philistines are actually occupying a great deal of Israel. So it's a total defeat, absolutely total defeat. And then verse 8 through 10, we just get this awful thing. "The next day when the Philistines came to strip the dead, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. They cut off his head and stripped off his armor and they sent messengers throughout the land of Philistines to proclaim the news in the temple of their idols and among their people. They put his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreth and fastened his body to the wall of Beth Shan. Now he is not only dead, now he's being disgraced and his body's being desecrated. They've cut off his head after post-mortem. They've cut off his head and they've taken his body and put it in a temple of this heathen and fastened it to the wall, some kind of show to brag to everybody. And they send messengers out bragging that they've killed Saul and he's now, his body's in this temple. It's a terrible thing. It kind of reminds me of the movies we see of the Old West, when a gunslinger comes to town and he shoots up some people, that the funeral or the pallbearer would, what do they call it, mortician. The mortician would take the bodies and he'd put them in a casket and leave them outside for people to look at for a few days. It's that kind of thing. Just kind of bragging about what had happened. And that's what the Philistines are doing. They were bragging because Saul had been defeating them and a thorn in their side for 42 years. And so they were bragging that they had killed him. Well, I love the men of Jabesh Gilead. Listen to what they did. When the people of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all their valiant men journeyed through the night to Beth Shan. They took down the bodies of the Saul and his sons from the wall of Bethshan and went to Jabesh, where they burned them. Then they took their bones and they buried them under the tamarisk tree at Jabesh, and they fasted for 7 days. So these men, these valiant men from Jabesh Gilead, actually did the right thing. They honored their king. They were loyal and they honored the anointed king, and they thought it wrong that any king of Israel would be treated like that, even in death. So they rode through the night. They removed their bodies from the places of dishonor, and then they burned them in a memorial, and then buried them in one of Saul's favorite places, the tamarisk tree. There you go. And then they fasted and mourned for 7 days. Very good guys. Reminds me of the Marines. No one left behind. They didn't leave Saul. They didn't leave his sons behind. They went and honored them. And that's a good thing. And so that's the end of King Saul's reign. And you're probably wondering, like I'm wondering, how David reacted to Saul being killed and him and his sons dying, who were actually enemies of David, but David never considered them enemies. He just he considered them God's anointed, and he kept trying to make peace with them instead of ever coming out against them. So how did he react? And we have a wonderful story of that, interesting story anyway, in the first chapter of 2 Samuel. We're going to read these 10 verses. After the death of Saul, David returned from defeating the Amalekites and stayed in Ziklag 2 days. On the third day, a man arrived from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dust on his head. When he came to David, he fell to the ground to pay him honor. "Where have you come from?" David asked him. He answered, "I have escaped from the Israelite camp." "What happened?" David asked. "Tell me." He said, "The men fled from the battle. Many of them fell and died. And Saul and his son Jonathan are dead." Then David said to the young man who brought him the report, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" So this young man tells this story. Verse 6, "I happened to be on Mount Gilead," the young man said, "and there was Saul leaning on his spear with the chariots and riders almost upon him. When he turned around and saw me, he called out to me and said, 'What can I do?' He asked me, 'Who are you?' 'An Amalekite,' I answered. Then he said to me, 'Stand over me and kill me. I am in the throes of death, but I'm still alive.'" Verse 10, "So I stood over him and killed him, because I knew that after he had fallen he could not survive. And I took the crown that was on his head and the band on his arm, and I brought them here to my Lord." So what does this Amalekite do who escapes from the battle? He brings the crown and an arm piece from Saul to prove that Saul is dead and to give it to David. And I guess the Amalekite thought that Saul was David's great enemy, and so he was trying to take a place of honor and trying to get some kind of reward. And to do so, he lies. He lies about it. He totally lies. He says, I'm the one who killed Saul. Saul asked me to, and I did it. I killed him. And I brought his stuff here to you. There you go. You're welcome. I don't think he got the response he was expecting to get. How did David and his men react? Look in verse 11. Then David and all the men with him took hold of their clothes and tore them. They mourned and wept and fasted till evening for Saul and his son Jonathan and for the army of the Lord, because the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. David said to the young man who brought him the report, Where are you from? I'm the son of an alien, an Amalekite, he answered. David asked him, Why were you not afraid to lift your hand and destroy the Lord's anointed? Okay, this is where the Amalekite just kind of like, don't have a good answer for that. Then verse 14, then David called to one of his men and said, Go, strike him down. So he struck him down, and he died. For David had said to him, Your blood be on your own head. Your own mouth testified against you when you said, I killed the Lord's anointed. So this poor Amalekite, again, the Amalekites, should have all been destroyed by Saul years and years ago. But this one was left behind. And so this one came and he told David this great story lie that he had killed the king. And David and his men wept and they fasted and they grieved and they mourned, not only for Saul and Jonathan, but for the people of Israel and the whole army of Israel that had been defeated. So immediately judgment was dispensed by David. There's a little lesson for us to learn here. Don't brag on yourself. Let other people do the bragging on you. Certainly don't lie to make yourself look better or more valiant or more brave or more courageous or more righteous than you are. That does not end well. Humility is far better serving. Keep that in mind. That's a side note. That's a freebie. All right. So David did not stop lamenting and grieving for Saul and Jonathan there. His heart was moved, and he literally wrote a song. He wrote a song of lament concerning Saul and Jonathan, and then he charged all the men to learn it and ordered it to be sang. And so the rest of this chapter is this beautiful song of grief, that a requiem that David wrote and sang about Saul and Jonathan. And just to show you the great love that David had for Jonathan, let's look in verse 25 to the end. It says, How the mighty have fallen in battle. Jonathan lies slain on your heights. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You are very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. How the mighty have fallen. The weapons of war have perished. So we get a real sense of this great love that David had for Jonathan. And this is not the first time we've seen this. We actually saw it before when they cried over each other and they wept and hugged on each other, and in the custom of the day, kissed each other on the cheek and made promises to each other. That's happened a few times. It said that their hearts knit together. And so I'm sure David was grieving the first king being killed, but it seems like a great amount of his grief was coming because Jonathan, his dearest and best and closest friend, had died. So now here we are getting into chapter 2. And David, after his grieving is over, it says in the course of time, he inquires of the Lord whether or not he should go back to Judah, because he's still living in Ziklag, the city given to him by the Philistines. And so the Lord tells him to go on to Judah and go on to Hebron. So he moves to Hebron, he moves his men to Hebron, and so them and their families are all there. And then David is anointed king of Judah. Verse 4, then the men of Judah came to Hebron, and there they anointed King David king over the house of Judah. This is an important point. There are, as you remember, 12 tribes, and Judah is just one of them. But Judah has gotten large to the point that they're almost the same size as the other 11 tribes put together. And David is of the tribe of Judah. And now the people of Judah, when Saul's dead and they have no more loyalty to that king, have decided to make David their king. And without much fanfare, they just come and they make him king over Judah. And David accepts. So David is now king. Is David king over all of Israel? No. He is king over Judah and the rest of Israel. And the rest of Israel at this moment is kingless. What's the first thing David does as king? David sends a delegation to go honor the men of Jabesh Gilead who had honored Saul and told them what they did was a good and great thing. So that's his first act as king, which I thought was pretty cool. And again, shows us more of David's character and more of David's heart. All right, so the order of the things that are about to come up are a little bit odd, but what you need to know is that Abner, the general, the great general of the Israelite army, begins to prop up a new king, starts taking back over the land of the Philistines that they've taken from them, and starts to prop up a new king for Israel, not Judah, but the other 11 tribes of Israel, which we will call Israel at this time. And so he sets up one of the children of Saul. Not all of his children died. He sets up Ishbosheth as the new king. Now this takes time, but what we need to see is that for the rest of chapter 2 through chapter 4, we kind of see what happens in the 2.5 year period after the 5 years it took Abner to get Ishbosheth put in as king. This brings us to a really interesting story that's just here in the Bible, that's not fully explained. And so, you can study it, and no one knows for sure what really happened. But I want to share with you this story that happens between Abner, the major general of the Israelite army, and Joab, the major general of David's army, because now he has that, now that he's king. So let's look and see this odd, treacherous contest that happens. Verse 12. Abner, son of Ner, together with the men of Ishbosheth, son of Saul, left Mahanaim and went to Gibeon. Joab, son of Zeruiah, and David's men went out to meet them at the pool of Gibeon. One group sat down on one side of the pool and one group on the other. Then Abner said to Joab, "Let's have some of our young men get up and fight hand to hand in front of us." Okay, so is this for entertainment? Is this like what happened with David and the Philistine, Goliath? Why are they getting some of them up? Is this just for bragging rights? Or is this to stop a big battle instead of having a bunch of people die? Let's just have a few men determine the outcome for all of us. I don't know. I don't know which one it is. But Joab says, "All right, let them do it." So they stood up and were counted off, 12 men from Benjamin and Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and 12 for David. Now, this next verse is the one that is the most argued over, and we don't have a full answer to exactly what happened. There are lots of opinions. I will give you my opinion, and you can make up your mind for yourself. So you got to have in your mind exactly what's happening here. You've got 12 men from the tribe of Benjamin. You got 12 men from the tribe of Judah that support David, and they're supposed to go in hand-to-hand combat. That's wrestling. That's fighting. That's karate, jiu-jitsu, whatever you want to call it. That's hand-to-hand combat. No weapons. Verse 16, then each man grabbed his opponent by the head and thrust his dagger into his opponent's side, and they fell down together. So that place in Gibeon was called Helkath Hazurim, which means the field of daggers, or, well, that's what it means, the field of daggers. What on earth? What it sounds like happened is that one side was ready to do some treachery and ready to fool and deceive the other side, that they were supposed to go to hand-to-hand combat, but they brought their dagger and were ready to use their dagger, and so they grabbed the guy by the hair and they stabbed him with their dagger, and that 12 of them killed the other 12. A lot of people think that actually what happened is that treachery was going to happen, but Joab or Abner, one or the other, was no fool, and their guys were armed with daggers too. And so both sides grabbed both sides by the hair, and both sides took their daggers out and stabbed their opponent, and all 24 of them fell dead. That seems extremely unlikely to me. So here's what I think happened. I think it was Abner. I think because of things that happened later, that this is the beginning of the treachery of Abner, and Abner was trying to get the jump on Joab, and Abner's men grabbed Joab's men by the hair and stabbed them, and 12 men died. And then it started a fierce battle. They thought they had caught Joab by surprise, but no. And maybe something like this had to happen for them to finally battle each other instead of saying, you're our brothers, we're not going to fight. You know, maybe something like this had to happen to get that kind of anger. To me, that makes more sense. I don't know the truth of it, but to me, that really fits. Is that Abner was treacherous, Joab was surprised, and because of this treachery, this killing here, it pushed the men into fierce anger and a fierce battle. And that's what we see followed right after that. Now, I don't know that for a fact. You can guess yourself or about what happened, and when we all get to heaven, we can ask and they can tell us. Verse 17, the battle that day was very fierce, and Abner and the men of Israel were defeated by David's men. Again, I think that just shows that Abner was a treacherous one because they absolutely went off on Abner and his men. The three sons of Zeruiah were Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. Now Asahel was as fleet-footed as a wild gazelle. So now we introduce to a couple more characters. So Joab is the major general of Judah, of David's armies. And he has two brothers that are high up in ranks as well, Abishai and Asahel. And Asahel apparently is very fleet-footed. He is very, very fast runner, which was a wonderful thing to be at any time in history, but especially then when there weren't very many forms of transportation and most battles were on foot. It was a very advantageous thing to have that kind of speed. Well, Asahel chased Abner, turning neither to the left nor the right as he pursued him. And Abner looked behind him and asked, "Is that you, Asahel?" "It is," he answered. Then Abner said to him, "Turn aside to the right or left and take one of the young men and strip him of his weapons." But Asahel would not stop chasing him. Abner did not want to fight Ashel dishonorably. Him being one leader, him being one of the sons, him being one of the leaders. I don't know why, but Ashel, I think, was probably a young man, the youngest of the three, because he's listed last. And here he is racing, and he doesn't even have a weapon. He is just chasing down Abner, literally just on foot, no weapon in hand. And Abner says, "Is that you?" And he yells, "Yeah, it is. He's coming. I'm coming for you. I'm coming for you. And I'm going to catch you." And Abner's like, well, stop for a minute and grab some weapons if you're coming to attack me, because, it's not a fair fight. But Ashel doesn't listen to him. And again, in verse 22, Abner warns Ashel again, "Stop chasing me. Why should I strike you down? How could I look at your brother Joab in the face?" But Ashel refused to give up the pursuit, so Abner thrust the butt of his spear into Ashel's stomach, and the spear came out through his back, and he fell there and died on the spot. And every man stopped when he came to the place where Ashel had fallen and died. All right, so forget everything I said. Apparently Abner wasn't such a bad guy. I don't know. Abner did not want to fight Ashel out of respect for Joab, and he didn't want to kill his brother with Ashel not being an armed man. And so Ashel comes up, and he would not be dissuaded. So Abner, after warning him twice, tries to fend him off by just using the back end of his spear, just butts him with his spear butt, not the sharp point, at the end of it. He just butts him. But he does it too hard, or Ashel's running too fast, or I don't know, but it went all the way through Ashel, all the way through his abdomen, and he died. And they kept pursuing them, and they kept killing them, until finally Abner yells out to Joab, "Must the sword devour forever? Don't you realize that this will end in bitterness? How long before you order your men to stop pursuing their brothers?" He reminds them that, hey, we're all brothers. Hey, we're all brothers. So Joab answered, "As surely as God lives, if you had not spoken, the men would have continued pursuit of their brothers until morning." So Joab calls off the chase. But Joab does not forget Abner's treachery. And that's important to remember. And Joab had a great victory that day. More than just the 12 that died, he only had 7 more die. There were only 20 men, including Ashel, that died on Judah's side. But there were 360 that died on Abner's side. So it was a real rout. So here's another little side note. Again, these aren't great lessons. These aren't even things you don't already know. But what can we learn from Ashel the gazelle? We can learn simply this. You can win the race, but still lose. You can win the battle, but lose the victory. And that's exactly what Ashel did. Ashel was so focused on one thing and catching Abner that it did not concern him that once he called Abner that he was going to be outmatched, and that he would die and lose his life that day. It just did not occur to him. He was too focused on his one thing, just winning that race. So how does that apply to your life? Well, think of it this way. Have you ever gotten a fight that you won, but you still lost? We do that all the time, especially like when we're in an argument with our spouses or with our children. Sometimes we're so focused on winning the argument that improving our point or proving we're right, we've lost their respect, and we've lose the battle overall. It's not worth it. It was not worth it. It was not worth it for Ashel to catch Abner to show how fast he was. It's not worth it sometimes for us to pursue winning a small battle instead of winning the war. And we can do that in our relationships. And I think we do it often in our relationships, especially those of us who feel like we're right all the time. And we have to just be right, and everybody has to see that we're right, and we have to beat other people down who disagree or argue with us. No, we can do that and lose the relationship in the process. Little side note, again, that's a freebie. Let's move on to chapter 3. Well, that did start a war. And so the war between the house of Saul and the house of David lasted, it says, a long time. And here's the important point. David grew stronger and stronger while the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker, which is exactly what the Lord had promised would happen. How long did it take? I think it took, like I said, in all 7.5 years, but with Shebosheth in charge 2.5 years. But long enough for David to have 6 children by 6 different women. I'll leave that there. He apparently got married more times and began to collect concubines. What's a concubine? A concubine is a mistress. That's what it is. Someone he's not married to, but that he's having sex with. So that's a concubine. And so David had those. And so he has 6 children now. And that's how long this had lasted. Meanwhile, over on Israel's side during all of this, Shebosheth accuses Abner of having a relationship with one of Shebosheth's father, Saul's concubines. It offends Abner to the point that he says that he is going to defect and go to David. And the Shebosheth is become so weak and is so scared of Abner that he doesn't even argue with him or try to say anything to him because he's scared of him. It says it right there in the Bible. So Abner does. Abner actually approaches David and says, I'm going to bring all of Israel to you. And so Abner goes about and he talks to all the elders of the different tribes of Israel, and he gets an agreement from all of them to make David king. And when he tells David that, David does say, good, that's great, but don't come to me unless you bring my wife, Michelle. Again, Saul had given her to another man, but David wanted her back. So Shebosheth actually agrees to this, and he takes David's first wife, Michelle, and he gives them back to him. Abner takes her to David, and the poor guy she was married to is following them and crying his eyes out in the street because his wife is being taken from him and given back to David. And Abner actually has to stop him and says, hey man, let it go. It's over. You need to go back home. It's over. So Abner comes before David, and David throws a great feast for Abner and a great celebration, and they actually have peace talks and make a treaty, and then he sends Abner on his way in peace. Almost sounds like a soap opera, doesn't it? Well, hold on. It gets even more so. So as soon as Abner leaves in peace, who shows up from a raiding party except Joab? Joab, the major general of his army. And when he learns that David has met with Abner, and that they have had a treaty of peace, and Abner is on his way, this treacherous Abner who killed his brother and was part of that Field of Daggers event, Joab gets furious. Verse 24. So Joab went to the king and said, what have you done? Look, Abner came to you. Why did you let him go? Now he is gone. You know Abner, son of Ner. He came to deceive you and observe your movements and to find out everything you are doing. Joab then left David and sent messengers after Abner, and they brought him back from the well of Sirah. But David did not know it. Now when Abner returned from Hebron, Joab took him aside into the gateway as though to speak with him privately. And there, to avenge the blood of his brother Asahel, Joab stabbed him in the stomach, and he died. Now Joab commits a great act of treachery, and he's just furious with David for allowing Abner to go free and to having a peace talk with him, is confident of Abner's treachery, and is also full of thoughts of vengeance and revenge for the death of his brother Asahel, the gazelle. And so he sends after him, and he pulls him aside like he's going to have a private conversation, and stabs them and kills them in cold blood because there is now a peace treaty. It's murder, plain and simple. How does David react when he hears this? Verse 28. Later, when David heard about this, he said, I and my kingdom are forever innocent before the Lord concerning the blood of Abner, son of Ner. May his blood fall upon the head of Joab and upon all his father's house. He puts a curse on Joab. But he does more than that. Look in verse 31. Then David said to Joab and all the people with him, Tear your clothes and put on sackcloth and walk in mourning in front of Abner. King David himself walked behind the bier. And they buried Abner in Hebron, and the king wept aloud at Abner's tomb, and all the people wept also. Then King David sang this lament for Abner, wrote a lament for him too. Should Abner have died as the lawless die? Your hands were not bound, your feet were not fettered. You fell as one falls before wicked men. And all the people wept over him. David really grieved Abner and the loss of this major general and this great leader of the armies of the Lord. And the treachery by which he had died, it just was offended David and was a horrible thing. And then we see in verse 36, all the people took note and were pleased. Indeed, everything the king did pleased them. So on that day, all the people and all Israel knew that the king had no part in the murder of Abner, son of Ner. This murder, this treachery, when Abner comes, actually with Ishbosheth's blessing to have a peace talk with David and unite the tribes once again. And when he leaves in peace and then Abner gets murdered, it had the potential to create a forever rift between Judah and Israel that would cause a great deal more war and loss of life and resentment and bitterness between all the tribes. And so David, brilliant, and I think with a pure heart, wept and mourned over Abner and cursed Joab and went to the extreme to appease any thoughts that the Israelites may have had that he had been treacherous with Abner in these peace talks. And he laid flat out in front of everybody the blame on Joab's head. And not only did the Israelites believe it, all of Judah believed it, everyone knew it, and it was to Joab's shame. Now, why didn't he just kill Joab and render judgment on him like he did the people who had killed Saul? Well, he tells us why. In verse 38, then the king said to his men, do you not realize that a prince and a great man has fallen in Israel this day? And today, though I am the anointed king, I am weak, and these sons of Zeruiah are too strong for me. May the Lord repay evildoer according to his evil deeds. So David is saying politically, it is not advantageous for me to kill Joab and his brothers because all of Judah loves them, and I am weaker than they are, or it would weaken my position if I judged them outright. So God's going to have to judge them because I can't do it right now politically. So delayed justice is going to happen. And I just want you to know that justice does happen. And we'll get that as we continue to study the life of David. Meanwhile, now over in Israel, Ishbosheth learns that that Abner had been killed, and he just loses all strength and all heart. And he just kind of becomes a recluse and retreats to his room and stays there. And these two guys that were actually commanders in his army that did raids came to him and killed him in cold blood in his bed chambers, cut off his head, and took his head to David, trying to, again, show that we've killed your enemies. You're welcome. Give me a great reward because I've taken care of it. We can all be united now. do people just not pay attention to what's going on around them? Did they not pay attention when Saul and his brothers or his sons died and how David reacted? I'm sure everybody knew about that. And do they not know that David had made a promise to Saul not to kill any of his relatives and not to harm a person in his house, and that David had been keeping his promises to the extreme degree? Some people just never get it, and these guys didn't get it. And so they came to him and they presented the head of Ishbosheth, and that's in verse 8. They brought the head of Ishbosheth to David at Hebron and said to the king, "Here's the head of Ishbosheth, son of Saul, your enemy, who tried to take your life. This day the Lord has avenged my lord, the king, against Saul and his offspring." David answered Rechab and his brother Baanah, "As surely as the Lord lives, who delivered me out of the trouble, when a man told me Saul is dead and thought that he was bringing good news, I seized him and put him to death in Ziklag. This is the reward I gave him for his news. How much more when wicked men have killed an innocent man in his own house and in his own bed, should I not demand his blood from your hand and rid the earth of you?" So David gave an order to his men and they killed them. I'm not sure I would ever want to be the messenger for David. I'm not sure I would ever want to be the guy to come and give him news, whether I thought it was good news or bad news, because you don't know how he's going to take the news. But here these guys had committed, again, more treachery. It's all we're talking about today is treachery. And had killed the son of Saul, Ishbosheth, and cut his head off and brought it to David. And it just absolutely infuriated David that they would do something so wicked, so vile, and against the house of Saul, which he had promised that he would not harm. And so he judges them. He's the king. He judges them right then and has them pay for it with their lives. Once again, as king, honoring Saul, the first king, and his descendants. So what is our lesson from all of this today? I mean, all we have here is just a bunch of treachery happening, but not on the part of David. David actually is doing something amazing today in these stories. And for the course of 7.5 years, David was patient. He was patient that God was going to fulfill his promise to him. He had been made king of Judah, but David knew that he had been anointed king over all of Israel. And he knew that God would bring all Israel back together without him having to lift his hand against Saul or his descendants, because he had promised not to, and that the Lord would take care of it. David, in all of this treachery, could have jumped up and defeated Israel and beat them into submission, but he decided not to do that because it was the Lord's people. These were his brothers. These were his people. They did as little fighting, I think, as possible, trying to keep unity between them as a whole. It was brilliant. But it was courageous at the same time. It was extremely patient and trusting and full of humility that David did these things. And so I think our lesson for this is sometimes we settle for what we think is really good instead of waiting for what God has for us that is great. And that's a good lesson. David, at any time, even way back to when he had the opportunity to kill Saul in the cave, David at any time could have taken over Israel and taken over the land and probably would have been loved by many, but he would not have been loved by all. And he would have taken it into his own hands and tried to fulfill the promise of God with his own hands instead of letting God do it. And the way that the Lord did it, with David not having his hands involved, made David a great king and issued in the golden age of the land of Israel. So David guarded his heart during this time when it came to this aspect of his life, and the people loved him for it. So learn that lesson. Do not settle for what's good in front of you instead of waiting for what's great that God has promised to you. Great lesson. All right, well, next week we're going to get into the next 5 chapters, 2 Samuel chapter 5 through chapter 9. And finally, David is made king over all Israel. It's going to start right away in chapter 5. And we'll get to see the first thing he does in his reign. It's been a long time getting there, but here we are. David is finally going to be made king over all. I hope you've enjoyed our lesson. If you like, please share this lesson on Facebook or YouTube. And at any time, you can go on YouTube and check our earlier lessons as we've been going through all the Old Testament. And I hope you'll join us again next week. God bless. Good night.